We're in the lab today working on what we think is the most epic PC build perhaps of all time. An issue we're running into at Storage Review is that as we're doing more AI work, as we're experimenting with Llama and Alpaca and visual AI models and all sorts of other activity, we really wanted a super powerful workstation to be able to handle those tasks. And now I think we've got the right parts in place to make it happen. We're starting out with the tie-in board. It's an enterprise server board, so while it's in a PC case, you can sideways rack mount this if you want to treat it more like a server, but we're putting the server components in it to give us the most possible power for the AI tasks we're working on. Tie-in offers this board in a couple different configurations depending on the networking you want on board. Ours is the 2T variety, which means we've got twin 10 gig ports. Now, while we've got a ton of storage in here, we still need to move data in and out that we're collecting to keep training our models. So the 10 gig will be helpful. We might get cheeky and throw a 200 gig NIC in here for fun if we want to get high-speed access to any of the storage over my shoulder. We might do that, but for now we're going to focus on the 10 gig onboard. We're putting the Genoa-X 96-core CPU in this box, and we'll talk more about that as we get to the install. Importantly, the board also supports DDR5. We've got a bunch of those DIMMs that are going to be going in, and it's highly flexible for storage. While there are two M.2 ports in here for NVMe, we can use that for boot if we want. We're going to go with U.2 drive for boot. There's a second U.2 drive. We're going to put the 61.44 terabyte Solidigm drive in there because why not? We want the capacity. We're also going to drop in 8 of those WD 22 terabyte red drives. And I know what you're thinking, hard drives, yuck, but there are use cases where hard drives are yum and you're going to want them in this build. We've got 8 bays in the front. We might as well fill them. Speaking of filling the bays, the PCIe slots are going to get a lot of activity in this build too. You can see we've got an A6000 here. That's going to be our primary driver for our AI workloads. We'll be doing our best to keep this graphics DDR full all the time while crunching on our models. We've also got this Apex X21 card. That holds 21 SSDs. In this case, we've got low-cost $39 1 terabyte drives from Solidigm. It's going to give us a huge footprint for our Steam library so that when our AI work is done, that we can still have a little bit of fun with this platform. And one last thing before we get to assembling all these goodies, the system has got to be able to power all of this goodness. The GPU, the CPU, and everything else is going to suck up a lot of wattage. Tie-in has included a 2,000 watt power supply. It's the largest power supply available in this family. It's a modular PSU with the runners for the GPU and the Apex card, so we can make sure that we've got plenty of power to both of those, and it still has the flexibility to do more if we add another GPU later or reconfigure the system. So Kevin's joining me now to talk about some of the other things that stand out in this system beyond just the GPU testing. And I guess, Kevin, you made a good point before when we were warming up for this, that this platform has so many PCIe slots that you could fit in a number of GPUs or a number of different GPUs because it's also got a little fan blower accessory that you can put on the back.
Most workstations aren't set up like a server would be for pass-through cooling, and that's where the system of the chassis provides the airflow, or if you look at a consumer GPU, they tend to have a fan on them to blow air through the heat sinks. This system does come with a optional back fan assembly, so if you had A2s, T4s, or L4s on the back, you could draw air through them and cool them and effectively turn into a pretty impressive AI box.
For inferencing, for sure, yeah, no doubt. So when we look at the performance of this system, so if we negate the GPU because that's so dependent on the card itself, you like, and I know Jordan really likes Y-Cruncher as a benchmark for the CPU power. That gets down to the nitty-gritty of what the CPU can do all by itself. So what do we have there that stands out to you?
Okay, so as we look at that Dell Precision 7960 with its Intel Xeon W9 3495X, it's a 56-core CPU, which is pretty good. Threadripper Pro right now tops out at 64 cores. Now,
well, interesting note though, because we're recording this on a Monday, and on the 19th, that game changes again, right?
Yeah, so Threadripper is going up to the 96-core variant, which is very similar to the Genoa-X, although a slightly higher clock speed. And but the point is, from a more consumer variant, up until that thing comes out, nothing really comes close to this. Now, when you look at the computational power from the Genoa-X, you start seeing very subtle differences. So at 1 billion, you're looking at 10.2 seconds versus about 12.8. 2.5 billion, you're looking at 20.5 versus 34.5 seconds. But 10 billion, This is where you start seeing a dramatic difference between the two platforms. This we got 72.5 or 72.6 seconds for 10 billion digits, while the Intel-based Dell Precision took 157.7 seconds.
Well, at a billion, the Genoa-X is only 20% faster. Well, maybe a hair more, 22, 23, just using my rough math. At 10 billion, though, the scale breaks. Like it's twice as fast, more than twice as fast.
Yeah, so there's certain operations that are single-threaded, RAM getting loaded up, where you don't see a lot of those differences until you start just saturating the CPU. And when that happens, there's a huge difference in compute power between these. And by the way, we only have the Genoa-X in this platform. This platform can also support the 128-core Bergamo. So there's even faster options for this.
Depending on the workload, right? Because we know not all applications can take advantage of the cores and the clocks in the same way. So some applications may trend better on Genoa-X versus the Bergamo, despite the beefy core count.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, but one thing this doesn't take into account is what happens on Wednesday when the new Threadripper Pro comes out. How does that look when we go to this Y-Cruncher stat?
So sadly, it's not the fastest, but it still stays very, very close. So for example, the 10.2 record that we had goes down to 9.7 on the Threadripper Pro 96 core. The 2.5 billion digit where we had 20.5 drops down to 19.7. Where we hit 10 billion in 72.6 seconds, that came in at 71.5 seconds.
So what's interesting is when we look at Y-Cruncher, then we get outpaced a little bit with the brand new Threadripper Pro versus the Bergamo X96 core. So that's interesting. You can't just assume, though, that going to 128 core Bergamo would be faster for Y-Cruncher. In fact, when we did that review, we saw that the Genoa-X with 96 cores outperformed the 128 core Bergamo. So again, it's just about getting the right processor for the right application. But when we look at pure computational power, it looks like the brand new Threadripper Pro has an advantage. We'll have more on that coming up. Kevin, one other thing that we talked about in a social video recently is power on this. You did a power consumption measurement. What'd you see in terms of overall power? Because this box is pretty beefy with all that storage and other stuff you had inside.
So this platform uses a little bit more power than the average workstation. We have 8 hard drives. We have 21 M.2 SSDs on that Apex X21. We have 2 U.2 SSDs inside this platform. And then there's also the A6000, the 512 gig of RAM. There's a lot of stuff in this particular box. With that said, we idled at 387 watts, which I would say probably isn't what you'd want your average workstation running at. With the GPU load, we got around 662 watts, CPU heavy load, 691 watts, and when you're running CPU and GPU together, just over 1,000 watts of power.
And that's just the single GPU, so know that if you added another one, you're going to tack in another couple hundred watts to this thing.
Yeah.
You may not want to place this under your desk, but there was also some conversation about the cooling because the included heatsink on this is pretty small, but the fan bank in the front's pretty beefy too. And we did see a little bit of throttling in workloads, but what's your take on that in terms of overall system performance?
So the overall system performance is really strong. I mean, we're a couple seconds off from the brand new Threadripper Pro. The part that comes up though is the CPU assembly or the CPU heatsink assembly on this desktop. Most of the qualified CPUs are like 270, 300 watts TDP. The Genoa-X CPU in this platform is a 400 watt TDP CPU. So when you're running a very sustained workload, you're going to see very high temperatures and some thermal throttling. Now, how much that is going to play into the workloads that you're running, that's up for argument, but you will still see some throttling. We didn't really notice, like all of our benchmarks took that into account. So,
well, we actually saw similar performance, almost identical performance of this chip in this chassis versus this chip in a 2U server chassis. So performance was in line with a perfectly cooled server, right?
A well-cooled server. That one was maybe 5 degrees Celsius off. So there wasn't a huge difference there. And it was also using the exact same heatsink, not fan. You have the passive cooling of the chassis, so there's some of that in play. And we have seen fairly substantial heat sinks in other server builds.
So for any tweakers that are trying to get every ounce of performance out of a system like this and trying to use a server board and server CPU and a workstation chassis, you could probably get a little bit more if you got more aggressive with cooling, but that's somewhat of a heroic effort considering the intent for this workstation.
Yeah, so there's some trade-offs, and honestly most people buying this particular platform will probably use a lower pin CPU with a much lower TDP.
When we started out on this journey, we set out to build the most epic workstation ever. And yes, of course, we cheated a little bit with a server board, server CPU, server DDR5, and a bunch of storage that most workstations would never dream of having access to. But the point of the matter is that at the time when we were working through this over the last several weeks, it really was the fastest. But it shows you how quick the technology industry changes. Since we started this with the A6000, we've got the AMD card in here now, this guy's come to market. This is the NVIDIA RTX 6000 Ada. This guy is a lot faster than the A6000. We'll have a separate video and review of that showdown a little bit later. But this came out subsequent to the start of this project, so in just one leap of GPU technology, this system got faster. In addition to the GPU, we're seeing a cycle in the CPU. So we've got the Genoa-X in this system, remains the highest power for what we were looking at, CPU available for those workloads. But in the traditional workstation space, AMD is out now with the Threadripper Pro, which brings 96 cores to that platform at a higher clock speed than Genoa-X. So that means systems from Dell, HP, Lenovo will all ship with that CPU now, and that's again going to change the math in terms of overall system performance. We've talked a lot about the flexibility of this system from a CPU perspective, but one of our favorite things is flexibility from a storage perspective. When you consider what this thing has, with the 8 hard drive bays in front, 2 enterprise U.2 NVMe bays, and then the PCIe expansion where we put this Apex X21, which added 21 more SSDs. This storage platform is really quite amazing, and way more storage options than you can get in any sort of pre-built workstation, which dominates the marketplace. So while Lenovo and HP and Dell make fantastic workstations, they don't have anything quite this flexible. Of all of our storage options, we got most ridiculed for including the hard drives in this system. To be fair, there's just no better way to get a high capacity at a low cost on a per terabyte basis. So we've got 8 of the 22 terabyte hard drives here. We put them in a mirror, and we saw basically 2.3 gigasecond read and 565 megabytes a second write. And while we may not want to lead with this as our storage for high performance applications, for a disk space to save output data and other things, it's plenty serviceable for that. When it comes to high performance storage in this system, we of course have these 2 U.2 NVMe bays. And while we didn't benchmark them in the review, we use this P5430 as the boot drive, 15 terabyte drive that runs a little bit over $1,000 right now, and the P5336. This is the gigantic 61.44 terabyte drive, not quite yet available in the retail channel yet, but we had these in the system, and that gives us even more storage options on flash. When it comes to really high performance storage, for your most important high-speed files, it's this Apex X21 card that has 21 of those QLC drives on it. What we saw here was 28 gigasecond read, 22.6 write, and that's in RAID 0 for the maximum performance, fun, and danger to have a super fast scratch space. But overall, when we look at the configuration of this server, so flexible, CPU, storage, GPU, everything about this is really quite fantastic. So like I said, when we started out, we set out to build the most epic build ever for workstations. Things changed quickly. Our review with the A6000's already been beat out by the Ada card, and now we've got the new Threadripper Pro. We'll be back with more video reviews of all of those systems and more content around this Ada card to see just how capable it is.